Welcome to Chapter 3. This is going to be Session 1 from Chapter 3, and we're going to be talking about how we're going to set up our page layout to help things to look pretty and to float the way we want them to. So let's get started. The first thing we talk about is the display style. So display style attributes tell the browser how to display the element, and we can choose from a couple of different options. The first is a block, and when we put things as a block, that means that everything is contained within that object. We can also set them up as a table, and then by using a table, we can create them as though they have rows and columns. We can do an inline, and when things are in line, that means that they will stay together with the other things in line with them. We also can have an inline block where everything is treated as a block, but it's placed in line with everything next to it. So you can kind of have an inline block, which works nice. You can also inherit the display properties from your parent. So if each element is not given its own display properties, they will inherit it from their parent. The other thing to remember with this is that if you set one of your parents, say you can set your default to block, or you set one of your parents to inline, everything under it is going to be inline unless you define it as being block. So what we like to do is to create a reset style sheet, which we'll talk about in the next slide, that will allow us to make sure everything has the setting that we want to begin with. Another thing you can do with a display is set it to none. None will prevent it from displaying by actually removing it from the page. It'll no longer exist on the page. Sometimes you want it to be on the page because you want to refer to it or use it in some way. And in that case, you would set its visibility to hidden rather than setting its display to none, because you don't want it removed from the page. You just want it to be hidden so we just can't see it. So we're going to create our reset style sheet, and it's always important to include a reset style sheet in any website that you create. A reset style sheet sets a base or default value for all the things that you want to do inside of your website. Again, since things are inherited, things will absorb the things that come with them. So if we set a font size and we just want one little piece to be a certain font size, everything below it will automatically be that way, unless you have a reset style sheet. So a reset style sheet sets some defaults. We're going to go over to code and play with that and show you how to do that. The first thing that we're going to do here is create our reset style sheet. Remember, we want to have every page in our site have the same style sheet to start from. So this will just set a couple of details about each of our style sheets. What I have up here is I have opened the folder for the tutorial, and I have opened up the first page in my browser. So you can see the CSS on this is kind of boring. You know, it's just all standard CSS, and we're going to be playing around with some of that. But the images are already there and the HTML is already there, which makes things a little easier for us. So the first thing we're going to do is go over to our reset CSS, which is this one right here. It should be empty. We're going to go ahead and rename it. Remember, we always rename it from TXT. I'm just going to reset it to that, and we're going to put in our name and our date. And we're going to get started. So first thing we're going to do is our structural styles. These are going to be our articles, our asides, our fig captions. These are going to be our captions for our figures themselves, our footers, our headers, our mains, our nav bars, and our sections. So these are all of our structural styles for grouping, and we're going to make them all a display block because we want to use the block display as our default. If we want to change something to inline later, we can, but at least this way we know everything starts out as a block. After that, we're going to do our typographic styles. Okay, so these are all the styles, and we want them all to be consistent in their typography. So we're going to add a background of a transparent because we're going to need no background for the purposes of these typographic styles. So we're going to make a transparent background. We're going to set our font size to 100%, and that'll be 100% of the default value. We are going to set our margins to 0. And we're going to start padding to 0. So those are going to be our default, so that in any case that we don't define it, we are going to be able to set those as 0. And the last one is our vertical lines. We are going to set to baseline because we want to have them vertically aligned at the baseline level, not in the middle, not in the top, so on and so forth. This is just going to be our base style sheets for all of these elements. And it's kind of nice because now you know where you're starting from. Since everything is starting from a baseline, that helps. Next, we're going to add a couple of things just to remove the list markers. We don't want to have those for our lists. There we go. So our nav list, we are going to do our unordered list that is inside of our nav. Remember, every time you make a nav, you have to put an unordered list in there. And we're going to do our list style is going to be none because we don't want to have a bullet or anything like that on a thing. And then our list style image is also going to be none. We may change that as we go along, but now we at least know the baseline starts there. We're going to make our links, so our anchor tags that are inside of our nav, to have a text decoration of none. And what that's going to do is get rid of that underline for all of our nav bar items, because we're going to make those prettier anyway. The last one we're going to do on this one is going to be our body, and we're just going to set the line height to be 1, because that's a good base default line height. So when we finish that, we should have everything all set up there. And let's refresh and just look what it did. Oh, and it's going to say it didn't do anything because we haven't attached it to our file yet. So let's go back to our home, back to here. Remember to put in your name and your date. Again, that is something that I grade on. So I do look and see when you did it. We did not do it in 2010. And we're going to go ahead and add that link. We've created our own personal style sheet for the home page so that we can have a different set of styles for our home than we do for the rest of our work. Now, when I refresh, you'll see everything kind of changed. We had this prettier script here, which is either from our styles one or from our home. Our home text, it looks like we have not modified yet. So this is just going to be from the styles. So that's going to change your font families. It's going to say for our nav bar, we want to use this champagne cursive. That's what we did here. So we said nav, and then when it's horizontal navigation, which is these, go ahead and make those this champagne cursive. And a couple of other changes. You can see the background changed to the brown for chocolate, and some of the other things have changed as well now that we have upgraded those. So that's a couple of different layout designs. Now we can refer to our page as either fixed or fluid, and our page is going to do a little bit of both. Most of ours is actually going to be fluid because we're going to be referring to it in percentages as we go along. If our web page or our browser is, say, 1,000 pixels wide and it's fluid, everything will kind of still stay in the same area because it's all percentage based. If it is fixed, it will cut off at that 1,000 and then have to scroll over to get the other, say, 280 or whatever it is we have left. There's reasons to pick both. So you want to be careful about what you want for your site. I like the idea of fluid because as the users increase or decrease the sizes of their pages, makes it easier to see. You can see the layout that we're going to be using for Pandesia chocolates. We're going to have a left column and a right column. Our left column is going to be about 1/3, and then the right column is going to be about 2/3, and that's going to have some pictures and some nav bars in it. We're going to have a horizontal nav bar at the top. We're going to have a header. We're going to have a footer that's going to have some navigation lists, and then, of course, our Contact Us section. So lots of different things are going to go into this page. When you want to set the height and width, you can choose to set the height and the width explicitly by giving it an actual pixel, or you can set them as a percentage. So 90%, 60%, so on and so forth. And that will help you to make sure that the page looks the way you want, again, whether you have a fixed or a fluid layout. One of the other things that I like to do is to set a min and a max width and height for my page. So if the page is too, if your browser is too large, you still want it to kind of fit into a certain spacing. So we can have a min and a max width for, say, our body, whereas we'll have a background for the rest of the HTML page. And you'll see how we do that with the Pandalesia chocolates. So to set the initial dimensions of our page, we are going to go to our home.css. So that's going to be this one here. We actually have not renamed this and added in our comments yet, so make sure that you do that. So the first thing we're going to do is update our body style. So in this case, we want to be able to have a max and a min width for our body of this page. So inside our body, we are going to say, whoops, there we go, max width, and we're going to set that to 960. So everything after 960 is just going to get filled in with a background. And our min width, we are going to set to 640 because that's as small as we want it to go and still look nice. We are going to also set the width of the page as a percentage to 95% of the page. That means even if it is within that 90 and 640, we're still going to be able to get that idea of, oh, sorry. I had changed the name. So by adding in that max and min here for the width and then making sure it's only 95%, we'll end up with some extra spacing over on the side, which is just what we want. So that the max of the entire page kind of has this brown, the lighter brown in the background. We're also going to update our PC Home in our body header styles with body and then the header and then the images that are inside the header. So those we are going to set to a display of block and a width of 100%. And what that's going to do is make sure that our images fill up as much of the screen as we'd like it to. So if it's a header inside of a body, it will only go to the edge of the body here. And again, leave this light brown on the edges because that's what we want right now. We're going to play around with that in just a second. So we should have our page body at 95%. The logo is 100% of the body width. And we have this body background here and this browser window background over here. If we change the size of our screen to make it bigger or smaller, you'll see that it'll change as we get smaller, but then it'll have a limit as to how much it shrinks. That's why we put in that minimum width, because that was important. When we have an element, a block element, we can horizontally center that element. Really important. Horizontal centering by doing this only works with block or inline block elements. So if you have an inline element, this centering does not work right. Just a heads up. What we do on this is we set our left and right margins to auto. As opposed to them being 5 pixels or 5%, we set them to auto, and what it'll do is it'll automatically make sure that your left and right margins are equal, which will in turn center the element. So it will make sure that your element is in the center of its parent, whatever that happens to be. With vertical alignment, it's important to remember that the element is contained within its parent. So its vertical alignment can only go as high as its parent's height. So when you talk about a vertical alignment, if you want it in the middle, it's in the middle of its parent. So make sure when you're looking at something from a vertical sense, if you want it centered, if you want it in the middle, that's how you would do that. Remember, we talked about the different options for vertical alignment in the last chapter: baseline, middle, top, bottom, so on and so forth. Okay, so now we've noticed this section is smushed over on the left-hand side. We don't want it on the left-hand side. We want it centered. So we're going to go back to our body selector, and we are going to be adding in here our margin left and margin right to be auto. And what that's going to do is that's going to center our body, whoops, margin right, and set that to auto. What that's going to do is center the body on the page. See, now we have our two sides left to right. A lot of times we want to float our elements because people are changing the sizes of their browsers so frequently. We don't really want them to be statically, you have to have 3 per line. If someone uses a really small browser or a website or a cell phone, you may want them to float where they go all the way down depending on what sizes you have. So we're going to be creating floating elements here so that as the user's page gets bigger or smaller, those items can float as necessary. Remember, by default, everything in the content of HTML occurs in the order given. It's very procedural. It goes all the way straight down. But what floating will do is either pull it to the left or right out of its position and into either a left or a right position. So when we float left, everything will float to the left, but it will no longer exist in line with the things below it. So you can have a float right that has things wrap around it as necessary or something along those lines. So floating is really, really useful. All right, in our home page, we have got all of these different items, but we want them kind of floated. So we're going to play around with some floating in this to make them look a little nicer. First, we are going to go to the navigation lists on the horizontal navigation list, because that one is going to allow us to take these 5 items here and float them across the top so they look nice that way. So we are going to say body, header. So again, inside the body, inside the header, inside nav with a class of horizontal navigation. And we want the list items that are inside of there. So go to the body, go to the header inside the body, go to the nav list inside the body that is horizontal navigation, and look at the list items inside of there. We're going to tell those to have a width of 20%. So there are 5 of them, and 20%, that'll equal 100%. Next, we need to be able to do just the navigation, horizontal navigation, and the list items without having to worry about the body and the header, because at this point it doesn't matter. So we are going to do, actually, let's throw this still inside the body header, because it's still inside the body header. Under the nav system, we're going to do our nav, horizontal navigation, and the list items. And we're going to make those a display of block. And we are going to tell them to float left. When we tell them to float left, we are going to say, for each one of you, and you're each 20%, we want you to float left and then wrap around. And what's going to happen is they're all going to pick up and they're going to do this nice little thing to make them all go to the top. See how they all came to the top like this? Now, at this point, we have these and they're not centered and they're not fully background. We are going to work on that. So we're going to format our horizontal navigation links. Again, inside of our horizontal navigation styles, we're going to do our nav, horizontal navigation, and we're talking about our links. Now, it's important for you to add the class here, because if we have any other links, those aren't going to work. If we have anything else inside of a nav bar that is not in the horizontal navigation section, that's not going to work either. So these, of course, again, are going to be a display block. And we are going to tell them to text align to the center. And that is going to allow those texts to go to the center and to fill up their space. Because they're a block display, as opposed to an inline display or anything else like that, they'll fill up their display here. So you can see each one of these links is filling up its parent and it's text aligning to the center. Now it looks a little bit better. Sometimes when you float, you want to make sure that the text that occurs next actually clears the float. It doesn't clear a floating concept. It clears as in it gets all the way past it, all the way to the end of it. So it makes sure that the item is all the way down to the next appropriate line underneath where the floated item was. As you can see in the example here, the orange box was just originally in the first position with 2 lines underneath it. When we floated it to the right, those two lines popped up naturally because that's how it would work. But we want the second of those two lines to clear that floated element. It wants to go all the way to the bottom underneath the floated element, the way it did before the item was floated. So in this case, we can take that and clear right, and it'll make sure that it'll clear on the right-hand side any floated elements over there. Okay, now we are going to be working on our left and right column styles. And if you remember what the text is, or what the page description was going to look like, we're going to kind of have a left column and a right column. So under my left column styles, I'm going to set up a section. So anything that's a section that is defined to be in my left column. I am going to say I want to clear the left floats. To make sure I clear all of those. I want to float those left, and I want them to be a width of 33% because it's only going to fill up 33% of that side. At the same time, I want to do my section for my right column. Whoops, sorry, in the wrong section. Section for my right column, and I'm going to make those float left as well and have a width of 67%, so they fill up the rest of the page. Now, before I go ahead and refresh this, oh, I don't know where my left went. There it goes. Let's go back over to the home and talk about that for just a second. So we had our header here that had our navigation in it. That was the top up here that we talked about. Then we have our left column, which is the section ID here. That is going to be this text here, this core, the text that we have here. And then the right column is going to be some of the pictures. So we're going to have the right column over there with some text over on the left. When we refresh, you can see this now went over to the left column, and all of the pictures are now in the right column. And this is 67% and this is 33% because that's how we set it up. When we want to make the right column finished though, because these pictures aren't exactly in the way that we want them, we're going to play around with a little bit of the images. So over in the right column section, we are going to say the images, I want them to be a display block. Right column. So not all sections, just the ones that are in the right column. I want them to have a display block, and then I want to tell them to have a width of 100%. When I do that, it's going to change these a little bit. See how it's kind of moved some things around. That's okay. We're going to fix that. So next after that, we are going to say in the section right column, then if you have a nav horizontal navigation and list items, then we want to set those to a width of 25%. So that took these four here and made them each 25% and put them with a display block. So each of these are 25%, filling up the spaces that they're in. If we come back over to our home, we'll see these are inside of a class called horizontal navigation. Yes, same class that we had up here, but this one is a little different because it's inside of the right column section as opposed to being inside of a header. And then we took each of our list items here and we made those be 25% because we really want this big one here to be 100% and each of these to be 25%. Still not done. We needed to tell that it was an image. Better. Now, what we've done here is we've said all of the images on the right column, we want them to be 100% and we want them blocked. And then the ones that are down here in the navigation, we want them to only be a width of 25 because they go in order of specificity, oh Lordless, specificity, how specified they are. The images get 100% first, and then immediately the list item ones down here, they're going to be set to 25. So that's going to happen. And we're going to get this nice, pretty little format where this is the big one because we really want to see those. And then a couple of little ones for nav bars so we can go to specific entries. So with a box model, when we talk about an element has a certain amount of size. Does that size refer to the element size, the padding, the border, or the margin? And we have 4 different sections of information that it can refer to. By default, some things are set to content box, which means when we're looking at the element and we're setting the width of the element, all we're setting the width to is the element itself. In this case, the 200 pixels of the element on the top one. So if I said I want my width to be 200 pixels, it means the width will be 200, but then I'll end up with these two 10-point paddings and these two 5-point margins on each side. The other option we use is called a border box, and that border box allows us to say, when we refer to the element, include both the padding and the margin in with our description of the element. So when we say the total width is 200, it actually makes the content 170 because we need to have that 30 pixels of padding and border to fit in on each side. Really important to be able to switch that. By the way, when you set the border box, you need to include your WebKit and your Mozilla browser-based styles on this because they will not by default use the box sizing yet. With the left column, we don't like that it's smushed right up against here. Remember, we had set our default paddings to be 0. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and add in a padding on the left side, or on the padding, just so that it looks a little bit cleaner. And we're just going to set it to 1.5. Just adding a little bit of space here and a little bit of space here. Now, intentionally, this did not work, and that's okay, because we're going to be moving on to refining your float layout. So to fix our block layout for floating, we are going to go back to our reset style here. And we are going to go to the section with the typographics things here with our background and our margins and our vertical align. And underneath that, we are going to set things to be a border box rather than a content box. And that's important. So we're going to use all three. We're going to do our WebKit, our Mozilla, and then our regular box sizing. But we're going to do WebKit. So with those three things, all of a sudden, everything came back to normal because this padding that we added in here, when we added that padding was no longer part of the context. So instead of it being 33% for just the text, now it did the text and then added this extra 1.5 EM around it, which meant 33 plus 67 plus that little 1.5 on each side was enough to push it around. So that's why we had to set it to border box so that even the padding is included when we set that to 33%. Doesn't cause a problem with that. We are going to go on to the layout of the footer. So in our footer, back again in our PC home, come down here to our footer styles. We're going to go ahead and add some details to our footer because you see our footer doesn't look very good right now. We're going to play around with that. So we're going to start with our footer and we're going to tell him to clear left. Clear left. And that's just going to tell the footer to make sure that he always clears any of the left floats. He already is because the left floats filled up the space just fine. But just in case we added more later, we want to make sure those are in. Then we have our footer and our nav, and again, a vertical navigation. So this is a little different nav because the navigation's vertical as opposed to horizontal, so we switched it a little bit. We're going to tell those to float left, and we are going to add a width of, in this case, we're going to do 22%. So you can see the different things that we have here for our footer. And we want to have those floated and have them at 22%. We also want to add in our footer with our section contact info. And we want to tell that also to be floated left. And in this case, have a width of 34%. Now, if we do all of the math, 22, 22, 22 is 66%. 66 plus 34 is 100%. So there are 3 different sections that we have for our vertical navigation, and we wanted those at 22% each, so they would fill up a total of 66%, and then be able to do the contact info with the remaining 34, because it's important for us that the contact info was the important part that you could see. So you can see now these are broken down into 30 or 22% each, and then our location and hours has a little bit more space. Our background is still a little dark though, and this problem is because this light brown, you really have a hard time seeing all of this. So we are going to go ahead and go to our footer section here, and we're going to add a background color. This is where having it clear left is going to make sure that that background color doesn't get collapsed because all of our items are floating. Remember that floating concept. RGB, and we're going to do 71, 52, 29. And we're going to get kind of a darker brown like the other text. Whoops. So as we saw with our footer, if you have all of your items floated, there is nothing actually still in the container to give the container any height. So our footer went away. So adding a background to our footer didn't do us any good. There was no footer there to do because everything was floated. What we do to fix this is we can add, remember we talked about this in chapter 2, we can add content to the end of the container that's just a space. It's not even a space, it's an empty space, but it's just an item that is going to say, I want to prevent my container from collapsing. It needs to clear both left and right anything that is inside of this item. So if I have everything floated, it has to go to the bottom of all of the floated items and then try to add, quote unquote, a table. In this case, the table is empty, so it doesn't technically render, but that's irrelevant. The point is it had to clear it, which increased the size of your container. That's why we can add in this after element to our footer and allow that footer background to come across, which is really useful when your footer background is like a darker color and your text colors are lighter. You don't have to change the background colors of all of your items. You can just change the text color of your element. Just make sure you prevent the container collapse. So let's talk about our container collapse, where since these are all floated, there is no container here. So we need to do the container after part. So after our footer, we are going to do a footer after. So after our footer, we are going to add content so that it doesn't collapse. Remember, when we do this, we do a clear both, because you want to clear both left and rights. You want to make sure you add a content of nothing, so an empty string, and you want to set the display to a table. The reason we set the display to a table is because it will not actually format anything onto the page or move anything around. It will just, because there's no table rows and table columns inside of there, but it'll still have the item for the purposes of collapse. And now you can see it didn't collapse this time, and it was able to show all of those with that light text and still make it look good. Container collapse is a big thing. You want to make sure you check that if you have any problems at all with your text. So that's the end of session 3.1. Hopefully that got you a little bit of ideas as to how your Pandalisa chocolates is going to end up looking out. Let's come back for section 3.2.